Hello everyone, and welcome to Ralph Reads, brought to you by TURN, the United Ronin Networks. My name is Ralph Anthony Garcia, also known as R4. The legal, the loyal, the regal, the royal, Ronin Ralph, your master of ceremonies. I would like to take this moment to tell you folks thank you for joining me on Ralph Reads, and to please tell a friend to subscribe to TURN, the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. On this edition of Ralph Reads, I will introduce the man who had inspired Donald Goines to write novels. His name is Robert Beck, but you know him better as Iceberg Slim. I also introduce to you his very first publication, Pimp, the story of my life. I'm currently reading the Holloway House version of the novel. As the saying goes, let's get the show on the road. Let the reading commence. Glossary. Apple, New York City. Bang, injection of narcotics. Beef, criminal complaint. Bell, notoriety connected to one's name. Bill, $100. Bit, prison term. Bite, price. Black, gunyon. Powerful, thick, dark, gummy, marijuana. Bukus, plenty. Booster, shoplifter. Boot, Negro. Boss, very good, excellent. Bottom woman, pimp's main woman, his foundation. Boy, heroin. Breaking luck, a whore's first trick of working day. Bright, morning. Bull scare, blustering bluff. Busted, arrested and or convicted. C, cocaine. Cannon, pickpocket. Can, derriere. Cap, a small glycerin container for drugs. Cat, a female sexual organ. Chili pimp, small time one whore pimp. Chippied, light periodic use of heavy drugs. Chump change, just enough money for basic needs. Circus love, to run the gamut of the sexual perversions. Coast, somnolent nodding state of heroin addict. Cocktail, to put a marijuana butt into the end of a conventional cigarette for smoking. Come down, return to normal state after drug use. Cop and blow, pimp theory, to get as many whores as leave him. Copped, get or capture, crackwise, usually applied to an underworld neophyte who spouts hip terminology to gain status. Croak, kill, crosses, to trick or trap. Cut loose, to refuse to help, to disdain. Damper, a place holding savings, a bank, safe deposit box, etc. To stop or quell. Derby, head, refers to oral copulation. Dirty, in possession of incriminating evidence. Dog, older, hardened whore, or young sexual libertine. Dossing, sleeping. Down, a pimp's pressure on a whore, or his adherence to the rules of the pimp game when the whore starts to work. Fix, to bribe so an illegal operation can go with impunity. Also an injection of narcotics. Flatbacker, a whore who gets paid for straight sexual intercourse. Freak, sexual libertine. French, oral copulation. G, $1,000. Gangster, marijuana. Georgied or Georgia'd, to be taken advantage of sexually without receiving money. Girl, cocaine. Gorilla, to use physical force. Gorilla pimp, no brains, all muscle. Grand, $1,000. H, heroin. Hard leg, an older street-hardened used-up whore. Heat, police, or adverse street conditions for hustlers. Hide, wallet. Hog, Cadillac. Hooks, hands. Horns, ears. Hype, addict. Jasper, lesbian. Jeffing, low-level con. Jib, mouth. Keister, derriere. Kite, note. Kitty, Cadillac. Larceny, to turn against by vocal condemnation. Lines, money. Lip, lawyer. Macking, pimping. Mark, victim, sucker, mitman, a hustler who uses religion and prophecy to con his victims. Usually the victims are women. Mop, hair, Muckety-mucks, a temptuous term applied to the rich and privileged by the poor and underprivileged. Murphy, con game played on suckers looking for whores. Nut roll, a pretense at stupidity or unawareness. Okey doke, a con game. Oil, pay off money to the police. Outfit, hypodermic kit used by addicts. Pacifier bulb, the rubber top of a baby's pacifier used by addicts to draw up drugs through the eyedropper. Piece, measurement of narcotics, usually an ounce. Piece of stuff, 1 ounce of narcotics. Pinning, looking, poke, wallet or bankroll. Reefer, marijuana. Roller, policeman, usually plain clothes. Roused, stopped, harassed by police. Shake, extort, sheet, police record. Shield, badge, shiv, knife usually made by convicts from various objects. Short car, sizzle, narcotics carried on the person. Slat, one usually refers to money or length of prison term. Slum hustler, a phony jewelry salesman. Smack, heroin. Snatch, female sexual organ. Snort, sniff or inhale. Spade, negro. Speedballs, a combination of heroin and cocaine injected. Spiling, talking, a term used by older hustlers and pimps. Square up, get out of the life. Stable, a group of whores belonging to one pimp. Stall, an accomplice of a canon. Stand up, to endure or survive. Stash, hiding place. Sting, rob. Strides, trousers. Stuff on, to play on or con. Threads, clothes. Three-way, orally, rectally, vaginally. To pull coat, to inform and teach. Turned out, introduced to the fast life or drugs. Uptight, in trouble, financial or otherwise. Vic, mark, victim, vine, suit, whale. Throw, usually applied to throwing dice. Wire, information, message, etc. Yeasting, to build up or exaggerate. Yellow, a yellow capsule containing barbiturate powder. Prat, to pretend rejection, to increase desire. Peel off, removal of only a portion of money from a wallet or roll. A pimp is happy when his whores giggle. He knows they are still asleep. All whores have one thing in common, just like the chumps humping for the white boss. It thrills him when the pimps make mistakes. They watch and wait for his downfall. A pimp is the loneliest bastard on earth. He's got to know his whores. He can't let them know him. He's gotta be God all the way. Foreword. Dawn was breaking as the big hog scooted through the streets. My 5 whores were chattering like drunk magpies. I smelled the stink that only a street whore has after a long, busy night. The inside of my nose was raw. It happens when you're a pig for snorting cocaine. My nose was on fire, and the stink of those whores and the gangster they were smoking seemed like invisible knives scraping to the root of my brain. I was in an evil, dangerous mood, despite that pile of scratch crammed into the glove compartment. God damn it! Has one of you bitches shit on herself or something? I bellowed as I flipped the long window toward me. For a long moment there was silence. Then Rachel, my bottom whore, cracked in a pleasing ass-kissing voice.
Daddy baby, that ain't no shit you smell. We've been turning all night and ain't no bathrooms in those tricks cars we've been flipping out of. Daddy, we sure been humping for you, and what you smell is our nasty whore asses.
I grinned widely, inside of course. The best pimps keep a steel lid on their emotions, and I was one of the iciest. The whores went into fits of giggles at Rachel's shaky witticism. A pimp is happy when his whores giggle. He knows they are still asleep. I coasted the hog into the curb outside the hotel where Kim, my newest, prettiest girl, was cribbing. Jesus, I would be glad to drop the last whore off so I could get to my own hotel to nurse my nose with cocaine and be alone. Any good pimp is his own best company. His inner life is so rich with cunning and scheming to outthink his whores. As Kim got out, I said, "Good night, baby. Today is Saturday, so I want everybody in the streets at noon instead of 7 tonight." I said noon, not 5 minutes after or 2 minutes after, but at 12 noon sharp. I want you down, got it, baby? She didn't answer, but she did a strange thing. She walked into the street around the hog to the window on my side. She stood looking at me for a long moment, her beautiful face tense in the dim dawn. Then, in her crisp New England accent, she said,
"Are you coming back to my pad this morning? You haven't spent the night with me in the month, so come back, okay?"
A good pimp doesn't get paid for screwing. He gets his payoff for always having the right thing to say to a whore, right on lightning tap. I knew my 4 whores were flapping their ears to get my reaction to this beautiful bitch. A pimp with an overly fine bitch in his stable has to keep his game tight. Whores constantly probe for weakness in a pimp. I fitted a scary mask on my face and said in a low, deadly voice, "Bitch, are you insane? No bitch in this family calls any shots or muscles me to do anything. Now take your stinking yellow ass upstairs to a bath and some shut-eye and get in the street at noon like I told you." The bitch just stood there, her eyes slitted in anger. I could sense she was game to play the string out right there in the street before my whores. If I had been 10 years dumber, I would have leaned out of that hog and broken her jaw and put my foot in her ass. But the joint was too fresh in my mind. I knew the bitch was trying to booby-trap me when she spat out her invitation.
"Come on, kick my ass! What the hell do I need with a man I only see when he comes to get his money? I am sick of it all! I don't dig stables, and I never will! I know I'm the new bitch who has to prove herself, well, goddammit! I am sick of this shit! I'm cutting out!"
She stopped for air and lit a cigarette. I was going to blast her ass off when she finished, so I just sat there, staring at her. Then she went on,
"I have turned more tricks in the 3 months I have been with you than the whole 2 years with Paul. My pussy stays sore and swollen. Do I get my ass kicked before I split? If so, kick it now, because I am going back to Providence on the next thing smoking."
She was young, fast, with trick appeal galore. She was a pimp's dream, and she knew it. She had tested me with her beef, and now she was lying back for a sucker response. I disappointed her with my cold overlay. I could see her wilt as I said in an icy voice, "Listen, square-ass bitch, I have never had a whore I couldn't do without. I celebrate, bitch, when a whore leaves me. It gives some worthy bitch a chance to take her place and be a star. You scurvy bitch, if I shit in your face, you gotta love it and open your mouth wide." The rollers cruised by in a squad car, so I flashed a sucker smile on my face and cooled it until they passed. Kim was rooted there, wincing under the blizzard. I went on ruthlessly. "Bitch, you are nothing but a funky zero. Before me, you had one chilly chump with no rep. Nobody, except his mother, ever heard of the bastard, you dig? Yes, bitch, I'll be back this morning to put your phony ass on the train." I rocketed away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I saw Kim walk slowly into the hotel, her shoulders slumped. In the hog, until I dropped the last whore off, you could have heard a mosquito crapping on the moon. I had tested out for them solid ice. I went back for Kim. She was packed and silent. On the way to the station, I riffled the pages in that Pimp's book in my head for an angle to hold her without kissing her ass. I couldn't find a line in it for an out like that. As it turned out, the bitch was testing and bluffing right down the line. We had pulled into the station parking lot when the bitch fell to pieces. Her eyes were misty when she yelped,
"Daddy, are you really gonna let me split? Daddy, I love you."
I started the prat action to cinch her when I said, "Bitch, I don't want a whore with rabbit in her. I want a bitch who wants me for life. You have got to go after that bullshit earlier this morning. You are not that bitch." The prat butchered her, and she collapsed into my lap crying and begging to stay. I had a theory about splitting whores. I think they seldom split without a bankroll, so I cracked on her. "Give me that scratch you held out, and maybe I will give you another chance." Sure enough, she reached into her bosom and drew out close to 5 bills and handed them all to me. No pimp with a brain in his head cuts loose a young beautiful whore with lots of mileage left in her. I let her come back. When at long last I was driving toward my hotel, I remembered what Sweet Jones, the master pimp who turned me out, had said about whores like Kim. "Slim," he had said, "a pretty nigger bitch and a white whore are just alike. They both will get in a stable to wreck it and leave the pimp on his ass with no whore. You gotta make 'em hump hard and fast to stick 'em for long, scratch quick. Slim, pimpin' ain't no game of love, so prat 'em and keep your swipe out of 'em. Any sucker who believes a whore loves him shouldn't have fell out of his mammy's ass." My mind went back to Pepper, then back even further, and I remembered what he had said about the Georgia. "Slim, a pimp is really a whore who has reversed the game on whores. So Slim, be as sweet as the scratch, no sweeter, and always stick a whore for a bundle before you sex her. A whore ain't nothing but a trick to a pimp. Don't let 'em Georgia you. Always get your money in front just like a whore." On the elevator riding to my pad, I thought about the first bitch who had Georgia'd me and how she had flim-flammed me out of my head. She would be old and gray now, but if I could find her, I would sure get the bitch's unpaid account off my conscience. Preface. In this book, I will take you, the reader, with me into the secret inner world of the pimp. I will lay bare my life and thoughts as a pimp. The account of my brutality and cunning as a pimp will fill many of you with revulsion. However, if one intelligent, valuable young man or woman can be saved from the destructive slime, then the displeasure I have given will have been outweighed by that individual's use of his potential in a socially constructive manner. I regret that it is impossible to recount to you all of my experiences as a pimp. Unfortunately, it would require the combined pages of a half-dozen books. Perhaps my remorse for my ghastly life will diminish to the degree that within this one book I have been allowed to purge myself. Perhaps one day I can win respect as a constructive human being. Most of all, I wish to become a decent example for my children, and for that wonderful woman in the grave, my mother. Chapter 1. Torn from the Nest. Her name was Maud, and she Georgied me around 1921. I was only 3 years old. Mama told me about it, and always when she did, her rage and indignation would be as strong and as emotional, perhaps as at the time when she had surprised her, panting and moaning at the point of orgasm with my tiny head wedged between her ebony thighs, her massive hands vice-like around my head. Mama worked long hours in the hand laundry, and Maud had been hired as a babysitter at 50 cents a day. Maud was a young widow. Strangely, she had a reputation in Indianapolis, Indiana, as a devout, holy roller. I have tried through the years to remember her face, but all I can remember is the funky ritual. I vaguely remember, not her words, but her excitement when we were alone. I remember more vividly the moist, odorous darkness and the bristle-like hairs tickling my face, and most vividly I can remember my panic when in the wild moment of her climax, she would savagely jerk my head even tighter into the hairy maw. I couldn't get a breath of air until, like a huge black balloon, she would exhale with a whistling whoosh and relax, limply freeing my head. I remember the ache of the strain on my fragile neck muscles, and especially at the root of my tongue. Mama and I had come to Indianapolis from Chicago, where since the time when she was 6 months pregnant, my father had begun to show his true colors as an irresponsible, white spats-wearing bum. Back in that small town in Tennessee, their hometown, he had stalked the beautiful virgin and conned her into marriage. Her parents, with vast relief, gave their blessing and wished them the best in the promised land up north in Chicago. Mama had 10 brothers and sisters. Her marriage meant one less mouth to feed. My father's father was a skilled cook, and he passed his know-how to my father, who shortly after getting to Chicago scored a chef's job at a huge middle-class hotel. Mama was put on as a waitress. Mama told me that even with both of them working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, they couldn't save a nickel or buy furniture or anything. My idiot father had come to the big city and gone sucker wild. He couldn't stay away from the high yellow whores with their big asses and bitch dog sexual antics. What they didn't con him out of, he lost in the cheap crap joints. At the hotel, one night he vanished from the kitchen. Mama finally found him thrusting mightily into a half-white waitress lying on a sack of potatoes in a storage room, with her legs locked around his back. Mama said she threw everything she could lift at them. They were unemployed when they walked away from the shambles. My father tearfully vowed to straighten himself out and be a man, but he didn't have the will, the strength to resist the cheap thrills of the city. After my birth, he got worse and had the stupid gall to suggest to Mama that I be put on a Catholic church doorstep. Mama naturally refused, so he hurled me against the wall in disgust. I survived it, and he left us, his white spats flashing and his derby hat at a rakish angle. It was the beginning of bitter winter. Mama packed pressing irons and waving combs into a small bag and wrapped me warmly in blankets and set out into the bleak, friendless city to ring doorbells, the bag in one arm and I in the other. Her pitch was something like this.
Madam, I can make your hair curly and beautiful. Please give me a chance. For 50 cents, that's all, I will make your hair shine like new money.
At this point in the pitch, Mama told me she would slip the blanket aside to bare my wee big-eyed face. The sight of me in her arm on a sub-zero day was like a charm. She managed to make a living for us. That spring, with new friends of Mama's, we left Chicago for Indianapolis. We'd stayed there until 1924, when a fire gutted the hand laundry where Mama worked. There were no jobs in Indianapolis for Mama, and for 6 months we barely made it on the meager savings. We were penniless and with hardly any food when a tall black angel visiting relatives in Indianapolis came into our lives. He fell instantly in love with my lissome, beautiful mother. His name was Henry Upshaw, and I guess I fell as hard for him as he fell for Mama. He took us to Rockford, Illinois with him, where he owned a cleaning and pressing shop, the only Negro business in downtown Rockford. In those tough Depression times, a Negro in his position was the envy of most Negro men. Henry was religious, ambitious, good, and kind. I often wonder what would have happened to my life if I had not been torn from him. He treated Mama like she was a princess. Anything she wanted, he got for her. She was a fashion plate, all right. Every Sunday, when we all went to church in the gleaming black Dodge, we were an outstanding sight as we walked down the aisle in our fresh, neat clothing. Only the few Negro lawyers and physicians lived as well, looked as well. Mama was president of several civic clubs. For the first time, we were living the good life. Mama had a dream. She told it to Henry. Like the genie of the lamp, he made it a reality. It was a 4-store, opulent beauty shop. Its chrome gleamed in the black and gold motif. It was located in the heart of the Negro business section, and it flourished from the moment its doors opened. Her clientele was for the most part whores, pimps, and hustlers from the sprawling red light district in Rockford. They were the only ones who always had the money to spend on their appearance. The first time I saw Steve, he was sitting getting his nails manicured in the shop. Mama was smiling into his handsome olive-tinted face as she buffed his nails. I didn't know when I first saw him that he was the pinstriped snake who would poison the core of our lives. I certainly had no inkling that last day at the shop as live billows of steam hissed from the old pressing machine each time Henry slammed its lid down on a garment. Jesus, it was hot in that little shop, but I loved every minute of it. It was school vacation time for me, and every summer I worked in the shop all day, every day, helping my stepfather. That day, as I saw my reflection on the banker's expensive black shoes, I was perhaps the happiest black boy in Rockford. As I applied the sole dressing, I hummed my favorite tune, Springtime in the Rockies. The banker stepped down from the shine stand, stood for a moment as I flicked lint from his soft, rich suit. Then, with a warm smile, he pressed an extravagant 50-cent piece into my hand and stepped out into the broiling street. Now I whistled my favorite tune. Shines were only a dime. What a tip! I didn't know at the time that the banker would never press another coin into my hand, that for the next 35 years, this last day will be remembered vividly as the final day of real happiness for me. I would press $5 bills into the palms of Shine boys. My shoes would be handmade, would cost 3 times as much as the banker's shoes, but my shoes, though perfectly fitted, will be worn in tension and fear. There was really nothing out of the ordinary that day. Nothing during that day that I heard or saw that prepared me for the swift, confusing events that over the weekend would slam my life away from all that was good to all that was bad. Now, looking back, remembering the last day in the shop as clearly as if it were yesterday, my stepfather, Henry, was unusually quiet. My young mind couldn't grasp his worry, his heartbreak. Even I, a 10-year-old, knew that this huge, ugly black man who had rescued Mama and me from actual starvation back in Indianapolis loved us with all of his great, sensitive heart. I loved Henry with all my heart. He was the only father I had ever really known. He could have saved himself an early death from a broken heart if instead of falling so madly in love with Mama, he had run as fast as he could away from her. For him, she was brown-skinned murder in a size 12 dress. That last night at 8 o'clock, Dad and I flicked the shop's lights out as always at closing. In an emotion-muffled voice, he spoke my name. Bobby. I turned toward him and looked up into his face, tense and strained in the pale light from the street lamp. I was confused and shaken when he put his massive hands on my shoulders and drew me to him very tightly, just holding me in this strange, desperate way. My head was pressed against his belt buckle. I could barely hear his low, rapid flow of pitiful words. He said, "Bobby, you know I love you and Mama, don't you?" His stomach muscles were cording, jerking against my cheek. I knew he was going to burst into tears. I said as I squeezed my arms around his waist, "Yes, Daddy. Yes, Daddy. We love you too, Daddy. We always will, Daddy." He was trembling as he said, "You and Mama wouldn't ever leave me. You know, Bobby, I ain't got nobody in the world but you two. I just couldn't go on if you guys left me." I clung tightly to him and said, "Don't worry, Daddy. We'll never leave you. I promise. Honest, Daddy." What a sight we must have been. The 6'6" black giant and the frail little boy holding on to each other for dear life, crying there in the darkness. I'll tell you, when we finally made it to the big black Dodge and were riding home, my thoughts were turning madly. Yes, poor Henry's fears had foundation. Mama had never loved my stepfather. This kind, wonderful man had only been a tool of convenience. She had fallen in love with the snake, all right. His plan was to cop Mama and make it to the Windy. The dirty bastard knew I would be excess baggage. But the way Mama was gulping his con, he figured he could get rid of me later. Only after I had become a pimp years later would I know Steve's complete plot and how stupid he really was. Here this fool had a smart, square broad with a progressive, square John husband infatuated with him. Her business was getting better all the time. Her sucker husband was blindly in love, and the money from his business was wide open to her. If Steve had been clever, he could have stayed right there on top of things and bled a big bankroll from the business in a couple of years. Then he could have pulled Mama out of there with a big bankroll. He could have done anything with her, even turned her out. I tell you, she was that hot for him. She had to be insane over the asshole to walk away from all that potential with only $2,500 in cash. Steve blew it in a Georgia skin game within a week after we got to Chicago. I have wished to Christ in 4 penitentiaries that the lunatic lovers had left me in Rockford with Henry when they split. One scene in my life I could never forget, and that was that morning when Mama had finished packing our clothes and Henry lost his inner fight with his pride and dignity. He fell down on his knees and bawled like a scalded child, pleading with Mama not to leave him, begging her to stay. He had welded his arms around her legs, his voice hoarse in anguish as he whimpered his love for us. His agonized eyes walled up at her as he wailed, "Please don't leave me. You're sure to kill me if you do. I ain't done nothing. If I have, forgive me." I will never forget her face, as cold as an executioner's, which she was as she kicked and struggled loose from him. Then, with an awful grin on her face, she lied and said,
"Henry, honey, I just want to get away for a while. Darling, we'll be back."
In his state, she was lucky he hadn't killed her and me and buried us in the backyard. As the cab drove us away to the secret rendezvous with Steve sitting in his old Model T, I looked back at Henry on the porch, his chest heaving as tears rolled down his tortured face. There were too many wheels within wheels, too much hurt for me to cry. After a blank time and distance, we got to Chicago. Steve had vanished, and Mama was telling me in a drab hotel room that my real father was coming over to see us, and to remember that Steve was her cousin. Steve was stupid, all right, but cunning, if you know what I mean. Mama, at Steve's instruction, weeks before, had gotten in contact with my father through a hustler brother of Mama's in Chicago. When my father came through the hotel room, reeking of cologne and dressed to kill, all I could think was what Mama had told me about that morning when this tall brown-skinned joker had tossed me against the wall. He took a long look at me. It was like looking in a mirror. His deep-down guilt cream-puffed him, and he grabbed me and squeezed me to him. I was stiff and tense in the stranger's arms, but I had looked in the mirror too when he came in, so I strung my arms limply about his neck. When he hugged Mama, her face was toward me and stony like back there with Henry. My father strutted about that hotel room, boasting of his personal chef's job for Big Bill Thompson, the mayor of Chicago. He told Mama and me, "I'm a changed man now. I have saved my money, and now I really have something to offer my wife and son. Won't you come back to me and try again? I am older now, and I bitterly regret my mistakes of the past." Like a black widow spider spinning a web around her prey, Mama put enough resistance to make him pinch himself into a sweat, then agreed to go back to him. My father's house was crammed with expensive furniture and art pieces. He had thousands of dollars invested in rich clothing and linens. After a week, my hustler uncle brought Steve to visit us and to case the layout. My father brought the cousin angle and brought out the best cigars and cognacs for the thieves. It was another week before they took him off. Remember, at the time I had no idea as to what really was going to happen. I would learn the shocking truth only after we got to Milwaukee. On that early evening when it happened, Mama was jittery as we prepared to visit some close white friends of my father. I had a wonderful time getting acquainted with the host's children who were around my age. Too soon it was time to go home. In my lifetime, I have seen many degrees of shock and surprise on the human face. I have never seen on any face the traumatic disbelief and shock that was on my father's face when he unlocked the door and stepped into his completely empty house. His lips flapped mutely. He couldn't speak. Everything was gone. All the furniture and drapery, everything from the percolator to the pictures on the wall, even my mama's belongings. Mama stood there in the empty house clinging to him, comforting him, sobbing with real tears flowing down her cheeks. I guess she was crying in joy because the cross had come off so beautifully. Mama missed her calling. She should have been a film actress. With only a bit part, an Oscar a season would have been a lead pipe cinch for her. Mama told my father we would go to Indianapolis to friends until he could put another nest together. When we got to Milwaukee by train, 90 miles away, Steve had rented a house. Every square inch of that house was filled with my father's things. Those lovely things did us little good and brought no happiness. Steve, with his mania for craps, within weeks had sold everything piece by piece and lost it across the craps table. Mama worked long hours as a cook, and Steve and I were alone quite often. At these times he would say, "You little motherfucker, you! I'm gonna beat your motherfucking ass! I am telling you, if you don't run away, I'm gonna fucking kill you!" He was just so cruel to me. My mother had bought me a little baby cat. I loved that kitten, and this man hated animals. One day, the cat, being a baby cat, did his business on the kitchen floor. Steve said, "Where is that little motherfucker?" The little kitten had hidden under the sofa. He grabbed that kitten and took it downstairs, where there was a concrete wall. He grabbed it by the heels. I was standing, looking down at him. He took the kitten and beat its brains out against that wall. I remember there was a park behind our house, concrete covered. There were some concrete steps. I sat there and I cried until I puked. All the while I kept saying like a litany, "I hate Mama, I hate Mama, I hate Mama." And "I hate Steve, I hate Steve, I hate Steve, I hate him, I hate him, I hate him." For many tortured years, she would suffer her guilt. She had made that terrible decision on that long ago weekend. I know my lousy old man deserved what happened to his goods. I know Mama got her revenge, and it was sweet, I am sure, but it was bitter for a kid like me to know that Mama was part of it. Perhaps if Mama had kept that burglary cross a secret from me in some tiny way, I might have been stronger to fight off that pimping disease. I don't know, but somehow after that cross, Mama just didn't seem like the same honest, sweet Mama that I prayed in church with back in Rockford. I went to her grave the other day and told her for the 100th time since her death, Mama, it wasn't really your fault. You were a dumb country girl. You didn't understand. I was your first and only child. You couldn't have known how important Henry was to me. I choked up, stopped talking to her beneath the silent sod, and thought about Henry lying rotten, forgotten in his grave. Then through my tight throat I said to Mama, to you, he was ugly, but Mama, I swear to heaven, he was so beautiful to me. I loved him, Mama. I needed him. I wish you could have seen beyond his ugly black face and loved him a little and stayed with him, Mama. Mama, we could have been happy. Our lives would have been different, but I don't blame you, Mama. I just don't. Mama, I love you. I paused, looking up at the sky, hoped she was up there and could hear me. Then I went on. I just wish you were alive now. You will be so proud of me. I am not a lawyer as you always wanted me to be, but Mama, you have 2 beautiful grandchildren and another on the way, and a fine daughter-in-law who looks a lot like you when you were young. The grave next to hers had visitors, an old man and a bright-eyed girl about 10. I stopped my bragging until the pair walked away. Then I said, Mama, I haven't shot any H in 10 years. I haven't had a whore in 5. I have squared up. I work every day. How about it, Mama? Iceberg Slim. A square? You wouldn't believe it, Mama. I wear $50 suits right off the rack, and my car is 10 years old. You gotta believe it now, Mama. Goodbye, Mama. See you at Christmas, and remember, I'll always love you. I know one damn thing. I can't help crying at her grave, almost as if I was crying because I did so much to put her there. Maybe the hidden hate that I can't feel wants me to laugh that she's down there in the earth. Maybe my crying is really laughing. About 90 days after Steve smashed my kitten, Mama cast off her spell. And one gray April dawn, while Steve lay in a drunken, open-mouthed stupor, Mama and I packed what we could carry and moved into a hotel room. It was complete with hot plate and down-the-hall toilet. Steve has stomped on 3.5 years of our lives. I would soon be 14. On August 4th, my birthday, our old friend Steve, with diabolical timing, made that event unforgettable. Since that chilly dawn in April, he had searched the slum streets for his escaped dupes, thirsty for revenge. I waited eagerly in the hotel room for Mama, who had promised to bake a cake in her white woman's kitchen. She said she would be home early at 6 o'clock to celebrate my birthday. Well, she came home all right on the 7th of August from a hospital with her broken jaw wired and her body covered with bruises. Steve had stalked her and attacked her with fists and feet and then escaped through the grimy catacombs of the ghetto. All that night and all the next day, I crouched in the dark shadows beneath his stairwell, gripping a gleaming ice pick. He never came back. He had moved. 20 years later, while oddly looking from the window of a plush hotel suite, I would see something familiar in the white-haired stooped figure of a garbage collector on the street 3 stories down. I blacked out. When reason returned, I was down there on the street, in the bright morning sunlight, clutching a pistol, wearing only a pair of red silk pajamas. A small crowd of passerbys stood bug-eyed, watching the strange scene as Rachel, my main whore, tugged at my arm, pleaded with me to get off the street. That was the last time I saw Steve, but I just don't know, even now, what I would do if our paths have crossed. Perhaps that beating Mama took was good, as painful as it was. I remember how it worried me in that cruddy hotel room when the hotel's neon sign outside our window would flash on her face. Her eyes would be bright, riveted on the ceiling. She would be in a trance, remembering, still hot for him. As worthless as that bastard was otherwise, he sure must have been a son of a bitch in the bed. After all that he had done to us, she still had a terrible itch for the bastard. That beating was good for her. It cured the itch. Mama had learned a bitter lesson the hard way. The country girl had rolled in the hay with the city slicker, and now I saw all of her sorrow and guilt in her eyes. We couldn't go back to the peaceful green hills of Rockford. She had destroyed a good man back there, a native son. Henry died a year after we left him. Until the grave claimed her, Henry would rise from his own to haunt her in the lonely gloom. Mama was desperate to save at least fragments of her image to hold fast the love and respect I had for her in Rockford. I had seen too much, had suffered too much. The jungle had started to embalm me with bitterness and hardness. I was losing, page by page, the fine rules of thought and deed that I learned in church, from Henry to the Boy Scout troop in Rockford. I was sopping up the poison of the street like a sponge. I had begun to play Steve's favorite game, craps, in the alleys after school. Dangerously, I was frantic to sock it into every young girl weak enough to go for it. I had to run for my life one evening when an enraged father caught me on his back porch, punching animal-like ass straddle his daughter's head. I had become impatient with the unusual thickness of her maidenhead. Chapter 2. First Steps into the Jungle. The slide was greased. I was starting my long plunge to the very bottom of the grim pit. I guess my trip downward really was cinched when I met a petty hustler who was very likable, and we became pals. My hustler pal was called Party Time. By the time he was 23, he had done 4 bits in the joint. Each fall, he had been jacked up for either strong-arm robbery or till-tapping. He got his moniker hung on him because as soon as he scored for scratch, he would make fast tracks to the nearest underworld bar. When he got inside the door, he would shout, "All right, you poor-ass bastards, it's party time! And Joe Evans is in port with enough scratch to burn up a wet elephant! All you studs stop playing stink finger with those long cock whores and everybody belly up to the log and get twisted on me!" His flat African features were passed to a skull that could have belonged to a caveman. He was short, powerful, and shiny black. He was ugly enough to break daylight with his fist, but for some curious reason, he was irresistible to many of the thrill-seeking white women who sneaked into the black side of town, panting as they chased after that hoary myth, "Nigger men do it so good, it thrills you to your toenails." There was a fast sheet joint with the trick rooms in the rear, right on the alley. I was peeping one night into one through a frayed shade when I saw Party Time for the first time. My eyes were bugging when I saw the tall Viking-type white man, his tiny but voluptuous female white companion, and Party Time taking their clothes off. Finally, they stood there naked. I could see their lips moving, so I pressed my ear and eye sideways against the window that was open a couple of inches at the top to get the sound. The white joker was tenderly hefting Party Time's weapon in his hand like maybe it was Ming Dynasty pottery. He said excitedly to the broad, "Oh, honey, can you believe the size, the beauty of it?" In the glow of the room's red light, that broad looked like an animated portrait by Da Vinci. Her eyes were blue fire in her passion. She purred like a Persian kitten and pounced onto the bed. Party Time stood at the side of the bed looking down at her. He was an ebony executioner. His horizontal axe cast a cruel shadow across the snowy peaks, rose-tipped. My trouser front was tented as I pressed even tighter against the window. I had never seen anything like this back in Rockford. Then, to my amazed ears, the white man said a strange thing as he pulled the chair to the end of the bed and sat on the very edge of it. He was breathing hard when he said, "All right now, boy, stab it into her, hurt her, punish her, crucify her. Good boy, that's a real good boy." The broad looked so fragile and helpless to my naive eyes that I felt a pang of pity pulse inside me as she moaned and whimpered in painful pleasure beneath the black demon, savagely pile-driving between the jerking white legs, jackknife imprisoned behind the sweating, hunching black shoulders. Like he was trying to make a home, Party Time was asking in a hoarse voice over and over, "Beautiful bitch! Beautiful bitch! Beautiful bitch! Beautiful bitch! Yeah, beautiful bitch! Is it good? Is it good, beautiful bitch? Is it good?" The white man was an odd, funny sight as he raced around the arena like a demented Caesar, cheering on his merciless black gladiator. Finally, when the show was over and they started to dress, I went to the front and sat on the stoop next door to the joint. I wanted to get a close-up of the freaks. When they got to the sidewalk in their street clothes, they were disappointingly normal. Just a clean-cut white couple having a parting chat with a grinning black Negro. The mixed-up couple went down the sidewalk away from me. Party Time came toward me. He didn't notice me sitting on the stoop. I was itching with curiosity, so I hit on him when he came abreast. It startled him. His face got stiff. I said, "Hey, Jack, how you doing? That sure is a fine silk girl, huh? You got a square to spare?" He finished a cigarette from his red shirt pocket, handed it to me and said, "Yeah, kid, she's fine as a Valentine. Two sights I ain't never seen, and that is a pretty bulldog and an ugly white woman." He was spouting cliches, but to a small-town boy, he came off witty as hell. I was in that brain-packing mood, so I put the snow machine into high gear to hold him. My eyes bucked in mock awe as I lit the square. I said, "Thanks, man, for the square. Christ, that's a sporty vine you got on. I wish I could dress like you. You sure are clean aplenty." He took the bait like a rapist in the nudist colony for the blind. He flopped down on the stoop beside me. He poked his chest out, his eyes flashing like a pinball machine gone haywire as he got ready to open up. He hiked the pants legs of his green checked suit to his calves to show his blood-red socks. The huge zircon on his right pinky glittered under the street lamp as he cracked his knuckles and said, "Kid, my name is Party Time. I am the best flat-footed hustler in this town. Money loves me and can't stay away from me. You see that fine silk broad? I got a double saw to lay her. Of course, that ain't nothing. It happens all the time. I could be one of the greatest pimps in the country if I was lazy and didn't have so much good hustler in me." I sat there listening to his bullshit until 2 a.m. He was likable and I was hungry for a pal. He was an orphan and he had just done a 2-year bit straight up, his 4th 2 months before. He had a head full of wild, risky hustles he wanted to try. He needed a partner. He tried all of them on me for size. I got home at 2:20. About 1 minute later, I heard Mama's key in the door. She had served a banquet for her white folks. I just made it into bed with all my clothes on when she came to look in on me. I was snoring like a drunk with a sick sinus when she kissed me goodnight. I lay thinking in the darkness until daybreak, putting myself into and trying to size myself into one of those quick buck schemes that Party had plotted. When the sun came up, fat and bright, I knew I would give Party's version of the Murphy a whirl. I didn't know his version was crude and dangerous and only a weak imitation of the real Murphy. Years later, I discovered that the Murphy, when played by experts, was a smooth, short con game with a slight risk. In any section where Negro whores operate, white men will flock to trick with them. I met Party several times after school at a pool room. He ran my roll down to me, and the next Friday night we got down with our hustle. Mama was serving a party, so I could stay in the streets until at least 1 a.m. Around 10 that night, in an alley in the heart of the Vice section, 7th and Vliet Streets, we unwrapped the package that Party had brought. I rolled up my pants legs beyond my bony knees. I slipped into the 25-cent red cotton dress from the Salvation Army. I put on the frayed red satin high-heel shoes. I pinned a scraggly piece of hair just inside the front inner band of the faded blue straw bonnet. When I tilted it on my head at a sexy angle, the ringlets of uneven hair hung down over my eyes like bangs. I stood wide-legged, flexed my thigh and hip muscles against the tight red dress, aping the whore's stance. Party looked me over head to toe. I was wondering how I came off as a broad. He shook his head, hunched his shoulders, and walked toward the mouth of the alley to catch a sucker. I got the answer when he reached the sidewalk. He twisted his head toward me and said, "Listen, man, stay out of the light, okay?" Within 5 minutes, he gave me the office that some action was coming down the street. I watched Party giving the pitch to a short, elderly white man. I wondered if I had enough voltage as a broad to come through with my end of the deal. He officed my flash cue an instant before the white man peeked up the alley at me. I jerked my skinny ass in a series of bumps and grinds and hopefully waved him toward me. That skinny black bitch he saw must have lit a fire in him all right. He fumbled his hide from his hip pocket and handed a bill to Party. The chump started up the alley at a hell of a pace for an old bastard. He had paid his money and he was red hot to take his chance to stick that hot nigger bitch waiting for him in the shadows. He had no chance. But in a way, he was lucky. Lucky that his hide had not been fat with greenbacks. If he had been loaded, when I evaporated through that gangway, Party, instead of fading away, would have come into the dark alley behind the sucker and robbed him with brute force. My heart was pounding in excitement as I galloped through the alleys toward our next prearranged duck blind. It took a new station several blocks away. Party time came moments later, looked up the alley, and hooked the tips of his thumb and index fingers into an all-is-well O. We beat several other suckers. None had the fare for the strong arm. We worked until 12:30. Then, unlike Cinderella, I stashed my mildewed costume, got my half of the $70 take, and raced home. Mama came in a half hour after I did. As in all other things, there are many Murphys. Real Murphy players use great finesse to separate a mark from a scratch. The most adept of them prefer that a trick hit on them. It puts the Murphy player in a position to force the sucker to qualify himself and to trim the mark not only for all of his scratch, but his jewelry as well. When approached and quizzed by a mark as to where a girl can be found, the Murphy man will say, "Look, buddy, I know a fabulous house not more than 2 blocks away. Brother, you ain't never seen more beautiful, freakier broads that are in that house. One of them, the prettiest one, can do more with a swipe than a monkey can with a banana. She's like a rubber doll. She could take 100 positions." At this point, the sucker is wild to get to this house of pure joy. He entreats the con player to take him there, not just direct him to it. The Murphy player will prat him to enhance his desire. He will say, "Man, don't be offended, but Aunt Kate that runs the house don't have nothing but high-class white man coming to her place. No niggas or poor white trash, you know, doctors, lawyers, big shot politicians. You look like a clean-cut white man, but you ain't in that league, are you?" At the pricking of his ego, the mark is ready for the hook. He will protest his worth as a person and his right to go where any other son of a bitch can go. Hell for a high-class lay, a double saw wouldn't faze him. Few can resist the charm of exclusivity in its myriad forms. The con player, still hedging, shoring up firmly, the convincer will then say, "Man, I believe you, and everything you say is true as gospel. In fact, I like you, pal, but try to see my side of it. First, to show you I trust you. I'll tell you a secret. I've been working for Aunt Kate's house for many years now as her outside man, you know, making sure only nice dates went up there. Aunt Kate and I got an airtight system. Friend, I know you will help me keep Aunt Kate's rolls, so let's go. I am taking you to the thrill of your life." While keeping up in an inflaming description of the whores and sexual delights to be found only at Aunt Kate's, the Murphy player had steered the sucker to a pre-chosen, neat, attractive apartment building. In the foyer, in a subtle but compelling manner, the con player nudged the mark into a fast meeting of minds. The question agreed on. As hot as he was, he couldn't go up before he checked in all valuables. It was Aunt Kate's unshakable rule. Aunt Kate was rock right never to tempt or trust a whore. Only fools trusted whores, right? The mark wasn't a fool, right? Right! The con player produced a sturdy brown envelope. The sucker counted all the scratch in his pocket into the hand of Aunt Kate's outside business manager. The efficient, affable manager shoved it into the envelope, licked it, sealed it, and stuck it in his pocket for safekeeping from the possible larceny in the hearts of the gorgeous dolls upstairs, 3rd floor, 1st apartment to the left, number 9 to be specific. The sucker was in a bubbly mood as he took the stairs 3 at a time. He liked that nigga down there who was protecting his money. What had he told him when he gave him the shiny gold-colored metal check? Harry, pal, this one's on me. Just go up and hand it to Aunt Kate. Everything is going to be all right. If you want, you can buy me a drink when you come down. The 2 strikes that had whiffed across the white man's mental plate and had set him up for the kill. The 3rd strike was first his desperate need to relieve himself into a black body. The 2nd was his complete inability to conceive that the black boy before him was intelligent enough to fool him to fashion the Murphy dialogue. Party and his raw-born lure, after 3 weekends of fair success with the Murphy, ran head-on into a round brick balloon. It was only 5 feet tall, but it weighed close to 300 pounds. It was a Saturday night around 10. The vice section was overrun with Johns. It seemed that every white man in town was out there, scratch in one hand and rod in the other, ripping and running after the black whores with the whitest, blackest asses. Party and I set up a blind on the fringe of the section, because with all that mad action in the center, it would be a hectic cat and mouse game with the cruising, rousting vice squad. I would have gotten something less than pure kicks to get busted making like a broad. Party hadn't strong arms since his last bit. The only reason he hadn't was simply that none of the Johns we had fleeced was carrying wad. We were fishing in the sand pile. All the hungry suckers were swimming in center stream. From my Murphy station in the alley, I watched Party eagerly for the office for action. Around 11:30, I was standing on one leg and then the other like a bored crane with a 25-cent dress on. After 5 minutes later, the office came through. Was it a man? A machine? No. It was a walking, living, round balloon with a fat poke and a flaming itch for black kush. It stood there, fascinated by my furious bumps and grinds. I felt prickly feet of excitement stomping along my spine when the balloon took his hide out. Party jerked rigid at the sight of its contents. Even as the balloon bounced toward me, I inched toward my point of evaporation. I knew the strong-arm lust had exploded inside Party, and sure as hell he was going to come up that alley and smash the air out of the balloon. I quit the scene and poked my head into the alley farther up. I could hear guttural grunting, the kind of sound a heart case makes when he's riding hard to convince a nympho that he's a raging tiger. It was the balloon that was grunting as he held Party in a crushing stranglehold. My heartbeat backfired and melted the starch in my props. I collapsed onto a garbage can. The balloon was also a weightlifter. Poor Party was hanging high over the head of the monster and then flung to the alley floor with a shattering whoop, where he lay like a rag doll. The balloon hollered as he leapt into the air and then fell like a ton of concrete on moaning Party. I was almost puking in pity for Party, but I just couldn't find the strength to get off that garbage can and join the fray. Anyway, it wouldn't have been ladylike. The derrick scooped Party from the alley and flung him across his back. I watched Party's rubber neck bumping against the balloon's rear end as he was carried to the sidewalk. I jetted out of there and went to the roof of my building. I watched for the rollers I was sure were coming to bust me, but they never came. Old Party had had the funky luck to try the strong arm on a professional wrestler called the Blimp. Party went back to the joint for a yard after he got out of City Hospital. One thing about Party, he wasn't copper-hearted. He never tipped my name to the heat. When he got older and lost his nerve to hustle, he got a crazy desire to pimp. He wasn't the type, but he kept trying until he ran the guerrilla game on a dope dealer's broad and was set up for a hot shot. Party tried his fists and muscle until the pimp game croaked him. The pimp game is like the watchmaker's art. It's tough. Party went through his life struggling to make a watch while wearing boxing gloves. Party's bad breaks sobered me, and I started hearing what was going on in day classes at school. At 15, amazingly, I graduated from high school with a 98.4 average. There was a sizable alumni of Tuskegee, a southern Negro college, who insisted upon Mama letting them underwrite all expenses for my education at their alma mater. Mama leapt at the chance. The alumni went into debt and sent me down to their hallowed school with a sparkling wardrobe. They didn't know I had started to rot inside from street poisoning. It was like the poor chumps had entered a poisoned horse in the Kentucky Derby and were certain they had a cinch winner. They couldn't know that they bet their hearts and blood money on a born loser. A rich bonanza was at stake, the success of my very life itself, the rescue of Mama from an awesome guilt, the trust and confidence of those big-hearted alumni. My mental eyes have been stabbed blind by the street. I was like a freakish joker who had gotten clap in his eyes from a mangy street whore. On campus, I was like a fox in a chicken coop. Within 90 days after I got down there, I had slit the maidenhead on a half-dozen curvy co-eds. Somehow I managed to get through the freshman year, but my notoriety was getting awful. The campus finks were envious, and it was too dangerous to continue to impale co-eds on my stake. In my sophomore year, I started going into the hills near the campus to juke joints. With my slick northern dress and manner, I was Prince Charming in spades to the pungent, hot-ass maidens in the hills. A round-butt, barefoot beauty, 15 years old, fell hard for me. One night, I failed to meet her in our favorite clump of bushes. I had stuck her up to keep a date in another clump of bushes with a bigger, hotter, rounder ass than hers. Through the hill grapevine, she got the wire of my double-cross. It was high noon on campus the next day when I saw her. I had just walked out of the cafeteria onto the main drag. The street was lousy with students and teachers. She stood out like a pope in a cat house. Her potato sack dress was grimy and dirty as hell from the long trip from the hills. Her bare feet and legs were rusty and dusty. She saw me, a wild heartbeat after I saw her. She battle-cried like an Apache warrior, and before I could get the wax out of my props, she had raced close enough toward me so I could see the insane fury in her eyes. Beads of sweat clung to the kinky hair in the pit of her arm that was upraised, gripping like a dagger a broken Coca-Cola bottle. The jagged edges were glinting in the sun. The screaming teachers and students fled like terrified sheep in the wake of a panther. I don't remember what athlete was reputed to be the fastest human in the world that year, but for those few seconds after I got the wax out of my legs, I was. When I finally looked back through the cloud of dust, I saw the crazy broad as a speck in the distance behind me. Mine had been a carper offense, and I was on it in the office of the school president. I stood before him. Seated behind his gleaming mahogany desk, he cleared his pipes and gave me a look like I had jacked off before the student body. He held his head high, his nose reaching for the ceiling like I was crap on his top lip. In a sneaky southern drawl, he said, "Boy, you are a disgrace to our fine institution. I'm shocked that sack has occurred. Your mother has been informed of your bad conduct. Our board is considering your dismissal. In the meantime, keep your nose clean, boy. You ain't leave the campus for any reason." I could have saved my own worry over dismissal. That alumni had powerful pull, all right. I got a break and got the chance to stay until midterm of the sophomore year when I went for the okey doke. I took a bootlegging rap for a pal. What goes around comes around, old hustlers had said. Party had taken our beef without spilling. Anything with a buzz in it was in great demand on campus. A pint of rock gut whiskey brought from $7.50 to $10 depending on supply. My roommate had scratch and a Fagin disposition. He was a Sharpie from a number racket family in New York. We made a deal. He would bankroll our venture if I copped the merchandise and sold it. He got my promise that I would keep his part in it a secret. He was a fox for sure. He gave me the scratch and I slipped up into the hills to contact the moonshiner who would supply me. Perhaps I don't have to say that I carefully avoided any contact with that broad who pushed me to that track record. I scored for a connection and the markup on campus was 400%. Everything was beautiful. The merchandise was moving like crazy. I was sure that when I got back home for the summer, I would have enough scratch to turn everybody green with envy. I recruited a co-ed I had laid to distribute for me in her dorm. It was the beginning of the end. There were 2 Jasper co-eds in her dorm who were fierce rivals for the love of a coffee-colored, curvaceous doll from a country town in Oklahoma. The doll was really dumb. She had no idea of the lesbian kick, so naturally she couldn't know she was a target. Eventually, the craftier of the 2 Jaspers wore the doll down and turned her out. They had to keep the secret of their romance from the other Jasper because she was tough and built like a football player. She was doing money favors for the doll, hoping to get into her pants. The doll and her jockey were in cahoots, playing the sucker Jasper hard for the scratch. One night, the doll and her jockey were tied into a pretzel doing the 69 and drunk as hell on my merchandise when their passionate outcries reached the ears of the muscular Jasper. The bloody fight and spicy details were topics for statewide gossip. In the heat of the investigation, my agent fell apart. She put the finger on me, and within a week, I was on the train going back to the streets for good. I didn't turn over on my roommate. I obeyed the code. Mama changed jobs a week after I got back to nurse and cook for a wealthy white recluse. Now, I really stuck my nose in the devil's ass. Mama had to stay on the place. I saw her once a week on Sunday when she would come in for a day. That was the only time I stayed at the hotel. I had found a fascinating second home, a gambling joint run by a broken-down ex-pimp and murderer called Diamond Tooth Jimmy. The 2-carat stone wedged between the upper front rotting teeth was the last vulgar memento of his infamy as the top ass-kicker of the 1920s. He boasted endlessly that he was the only nigger pimp on earth who had ever pimped in parents on French girls. I was to discover later when I would meet and be trained by the master that Jimmy was a mere buffoon, an amateur not fit to hold the master's coat. After the suckers were trimmed and all the shills had been paid, Jimmy would lock the door and then, like a ritual, light up a thin brown reefer. As he talked, he would pass it to me, cursing me affably for not inhaling deeply and holding the smoke, as he put it, deep in my belly. When dawn broke, he would go out through the joint door home to the 19-year-old Jasper on whom he lavished furs and jewels. He was a real sucker. I would go to bed in the tiny cubicle in the rear of the joint and dream fantastic dreams. Always beautiful whores would get down on their knees and tearfully beg me to take their money. For several months I have been screwing the luscious daughter of a popular band leader. She was 15. Her name was June, and she had a wild yen for me. She had a habit of waiting down the street from a gambling joint until Jimmy left. Then she would come up and get on the army cop with me. She would stay until 7 o'clock at night. She knew I had to clean the joint for action around 9. One day around noon I asked her, "Do you love me enough to do anything for me?" She said yes. So I said, "Even turn a trick?" She said, "Anything." I put my clothes on and went to the street and saw an old gambler who I knew was a trick and told him what was upstairs. Sure enough, he gave me a $5 bill, the asking price, and I took him upstairs and let him in on her. She turned him in less than 5 minutes. My 17-year-old brain reeled. This was still the Depression. I could get rich with this girl and drive a big white Packard. My next prospect was all wrong. He was an acquaintance of the band leader, June's father. He went up the stairs, saw her, and called the father in Pittsburgh. The father called the local police department, and my pimping career died a borning. When the detective came, I was still out there looking for tricks for the down payment on that big white Packard. Diamond Tooth's bullshit had screwed me for certain. My mother, of course, was shocked. She was sure it was a frame-up. That June, that evil girl, had led her sweet little Bobby astray. At the county jail, 2 days before my trial, I left my cell on an attorney consultation pass. A short, gopher-faced Negro sat in the cage in an old oak desk grinning at me. My blood ran cold. My palms got slippery wet as I took a seat across from him. The gleaming yellow gold teeth filling his mouth had been a flash of doom. Christ, I thought, a deep south nigger lip. Didn't Mama know that most of them turn to jelly when defending a criminal case? The rodent wiped his blue-black brow with a soggy handkerchief and said,
"Well, Bobby, it seems you're in a little bit of trouble, huh? I'm Attorney Williams, an old friend of your family. I knew your mother as girl."
My eyes sent special delivery murder across the table to that ugly bastard. I said, "It ain't a little trouble." He fingered his dollar necktie and hoisted his starved shoulders inside the jacket of his cheap vine and said,
"Oh, now, let's not be fatalistic. You are a first offender, and I'm positive it will mitigate the charge. Rest assured, I will press the court for leniency. Now, tell me the whole truth about your trouble."
Anger, everything drained out of me. I was lost, stricken. The phony would lead me to the slaughter. I knew I was already tried and convicted and sentenced to the joint. The only loose end was for how long. Without hearing it myself, I ran down the details to him and stumbled blindly back to my cell. On my trial day in the courtroom, the shaky bastard was so nervous before the bench when he pleaded me guilty that the same cheap vine that he had worn out at the first meeting was soaked by his sweat. He was so shook up by the stern face and voice of the white hawk-faced judge that he forgot to ask for leniency. That awful fear the white folks had put into him down south was still painfully alive in him. He just stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the judge to sentence me. So I looked up into the frosty blue eyes and said, "Your Honor, I am sorry for what I did. I've never been in trouble before. If Your Honor would just give me a break this time, I swear before the Lord, I won't ever come back down here. Please, Your Honor, don't send me to the pen." The frost deepened in his eyes as he looked down at me and intoned, "You are a vicious young man. Your crime against that innocent young girl, against the laws of this state, is inexcusable. The very nature of your crime precludes the possibility of probation. For your own good and for that of society's, I sentence you to the state reformatory to a term for not less than 1 year and for not more than 18 months. I hope it teaches you a lesson." I shrugged off the wet hand of the lip from my shoulder, avoided the tear-reddened eyes of Mama sobbing quietly in the rear of the courtroom, and stuck my hands out to the bailiff for the icy-cold handcuffs. June's old man was a big wheel with lots of muscle in the courts. He had gone behind the scenes and pulled strings and put the cinch on the joint for me. My sentence was for carnal knowledge and abuse, reduced from pandering, because you can't pander from anything except a whore, and June's old man wasn't about to go for that. Yes, I was sure working at that first patch of gray in my mother's hair. Steve would have been proud of me, don't you think? My sentence to the Wisconsin Green Bay Reformatory almost cracked Mama up. There were several repeaters from the reformatory on my tier at county jail who tried to bug the first offenders with terrible stories about the hard time up at the reformatory. While we were waiting for the van to take us upstate to the reformatory, I was too dumb to feel anything. A fool I was to think the dummy was a fairy tale. In the 2 weeks that I waited, Mama wrote me a letter every day and visited twice. Mama's guilt and heartbreak were weighing heavily on her. Back in Rockford, she had been a dutiful churchgoer, leading a Christian life until Steve came on the scene. But now when I read her long, rambling letters crammed with threats of fire and brimstone from me if I didn't get Jesus in my heart and respect the Holy Ghost and that fire, I realized that poor Mama was becoming a religious fanatic to save her sanity. The pressures of Henry's death and now my plight must have been awful. The van came to get us on a stormy, thunderous morning. As we stepped into the van, handcuffed together, I saw Mama standing in the icy, driving rain, waving goodbye. I could feel a hot, throbbing lump at the base of my throat to see her standing there looking so sad and lonesome, cowering beneath the battering rain. I could feel the tears aching to flow, but I couldn't cry. Mama never told me how she found out the time the van would come. I still wonder how she found out and what her thoughts were out there in the storm as she watched me start my journey. The state called it a reformatory, but believe me, it was a prison for real. My belly fluttered when the van pulled into the prison road leading to the joint. The van had been vibrating with horseplay and profane ribbon among the 20-odd prisoners. Only one of them had sat tensely and silently during the entire trip, the fat fellow next to me. But when those high slate gray walls loomed grimly before us, it was as if a giant fist had slugged the breath from us all. Even the repeaters who have served time behind those walls were silent, tight-faced. I started to believe those stories they had told back in county jail. The van went through 3 gates, manned by rock-faced hacks carrying scoped, high-powered rifles. 3 casket gray cell houses stood like mute mourners beneath the bleak, sunless sky. For the first time in my life, I felt raw, grinding fear. The fat Negro sitting next to me was a former schoolmate of mine in high school. He had been a dedicated member of the Holiness Church then. I had never gotten friendly with him because his only interest at the time seemed to be his church and his Bible. He didn't smoke or swear, chase broads, or gamble. He had been a rock-ribbed square. His name was Oscar. Apparently, he was still square because now his eyes were closed and I could hear bits of prayer as he whispered softly. Oscar's prayer was abruptly cut off by the screech of the van's brakes as it stopped in front of the prison check-in station and bathhouse. We clambered out and stood in line to have our handcuffs removed. 2 screws started at each of the line, unlocking the cuffs. As they moved toward the middle of the line, they stifled the thin whispers of the men. They said to each man, "Button it up! Silence! No talking!" Oscar was shaking and trembling in front of me as we filed into a brightly lit, high-ceilinged room. A rough pine counter stretched for 20 yards down the green and gray flagstone floor that looked clean enough to eat from. This was the part of the shiny, clean skin of the apple. The inside was rotting and foul. Cons with starched white faces stood behind the long counter guessing our sizes as we passed them and passing out faded pieces of our uniform from caps to brogans. We passed with our bundles into a large room. A tall, silent screw, dazzling with brass buttons and gold braid on his navy blue uniform, slashed his lead-loaded cane through the air like a vocal sword, directing us to put our bundles on the long bench and to undress us for a short-arm inspection and a brief exam by the prison croaker seated at a battered steel desk in the back of the room. Finally, we had all been checked by the croaker and showered. The gold-spangled screw raised his talkative cane. It told us to go out the door and turn left, then straight ahead. 2 screws marched alongside as we made it toward a squat sandstone building 200 yards away. Was that talking cane the dummies? I heard it before I saw it, a loud scraping, thunder laced with a hollow roar. Never before had I heard anything like it. Then, mysteriously, in the dimness, countless young grim faces seemed to be bobbing in a sea of gray. 100 feet away, I saw the mystery. Hundreds of gray-clad cons were lockstepping from the mess halls into 3 cell houses. There were an eerie sight in the twilight, marching mutely in cadence like tragic robot soldiers. The roaring thunder was the scrape and thump of their heavy prison brogans. We reached the squat building. We were to stay in its quarantine cells for the next 10 days. All fish, new cons, were housed here to be given a thorough medical checkout and classification before being assigned to work details out in population. I got a putrid taste of the inside of that apple when cons in white uniforms and peaked caps gave us our supper through a slot in our cell doors. It was barley soup with a hunk of brown bread. It would have made great shrapnel in a grenade. I was new and learning, so instead of just gulping it down, I took a long, close look at the odd little things black dotted at one end. I puked until my belly cramped. The barley in the soup was lousy with worms. The lights went out at 9. Every hour or so, a screw came by the row of cells. He would poke the bright eye of his flashlight into a cell and then squint his eyes as he looked into each cell. I wondered if it were a capital crime in this joint to get caught having an affair with Lady Five Fingers. I flapped my ears when I heard one of the white repeaters running down the joint in a whisper to a fish. Oscar was listening too because he had stopped praying in his cell next to mine. The white fish was saying,
"Look, Rocky, what the hell gives with that hack in the bathhouse? Why don't the jack-off never rap? What's with that cane bit?"
The repeater said, "The son of a bitch is stir crazy. His voice box screwed up on him a dime ago. He's been the brass nuts here for a double dime, and guess how the bastard lost his rapper?" That screw and his light was making the rounds again, so the repeater got on the dummy. When the screw had passed, he continued, "The creep was called Foghorn by the cons before his trouble made him a dummy. They say the bastard's bellows could be heard from one side of the joint to the other. He's the meanest captain of screws this joint's ever had. In the last double dime, he had croaked 2 white cons and 4 spades with his cane. He hates niggas." Oscar was praying like mad now. He had heard what the repeater said about those 4 Negroes. The fish wanted a loose end tied for him. He said,
"Yeah, Rocky, just to glim him and you know he's rough. But what in the hell cut his box off?"
The repeater said, "Oh, the vine has it he treated his wife and Crumb Crusher worse than he did the cons. She got her fill of his screwing and drilled herself and the kid through the head. The little broad was only 2 years old. The note his broad left said,
'I can't stand your hollering any longer. Goodbye.'
A head shrinker here at the time said, when the broad croaked herself, it shut off Brass Nuts' box." I lay there thinking about what the con had just said. I thought about Oscar and wondered if he could pull his bit or if he would go back to his parents in the pine box, or worse, to the crazy farm. Oscar had been sentenced to a year by the same judge that had socked it into me. Oscar, poor chump, had started going with a crippled Irish girl of 17. In the dark balcony of a downtown theater, they were seen smooching by the son of a close friend of the girl's family. He reported post-haste to his parents, who wired up the girl's parents. They were Irish, with temper and prejudice. They third-degreed the girl, and she confessed that old black Oscar had indeed trespassed the Forbidden Valley. The charge of statutory rape naturally stood up, and here was old Oscar next door to me. I slapped the itching sting on my thigh. I pulled the sheet back. Lord have mercy, how I hated them. It was a bed bug I had smashed, but he was only a scout. When that flashlight jarred me awake an hour later, a division of them was parading the walls. I lay wide-eyed until morning. The inside of that shiny apple was really something else. After all our tests, we fish were taken out of the quarantine tank on the 10th day to the warden's office. My turn came to go in. I got up from the long bench in the hall outside his office and walked in. My knees were having a boxing match as I stood before him. He was a silver-maned, profane, huge white bull with 2 tiny chunks of black fire rammed deep into his eye sockets. He said, Well, Sambo, you sure got your black nigger ass in a sling, didn't you? Well, understand me. We didn't send for you, but you came. We are here to punish you smart aleck bastards, so if you fuck around, two things can happen to you. Both of them horrible. We got a hole here that we bury tough punks in. It's a strip cell without light 20 feet below ground. Down there, 2 slices of bread and a pint of water twice a day. You can go out that north gate in a box for your second choice. So take this rule book and study it. Now get your rusty black ass out my face. The only thing I said before I eased out of there was, "Yes sir, boss man." And I was grinning like a Mississippi rape suspect turned loose by the mob. It was a wise thing I had unclad on him. One of those arrogant repeaters went to the hole for having a sassy look in his eye. The charge was visual insubordination. Oscar and I were assigned to work and live in cell block B. It was all black. Of the 3, it was the only one without toilets. We had buckets in cells that we took out each morning and dumped into running water in a trough behind a cell block. The only stench in my life I have ever smelt that was worse than that cell block on a warm night was a sick hype. It was rough all night and a terrible battle of wits. The battle mainly centered around staying out of sight and trouble with the dummy. He walked on the balls of his feet, and he could read a con's mind. It was terrifying to have maybe a slice of contraband bread in your bosom, and then from nowhere have the dummy pop up. He didn't pass out an instruction leaflet running down the lingo of that cane. If you misunderstood what it said, the dummy would crack the leaded shaft of it against your skull till you bled. After I put in 6 months on my bit, a young Negro con came in on transfer from the big joint and brought me a wire from party. He sent word that we were still tight and I was his horse if I never won a race. It felt good to know he had forgiven me for turning chicken back there in the alley with the balloon. The dummy hated everybody. He felt something much more frightful for Oscar. I don't know whether it was that the dummy had a hate for God too, and he knew how religious Oscar was and had focused all of his hate on a living target. Oscar and I shared a double bunk cell. I had the bottom bunk. It was a chilling sight at night when the dummy should have been at home to look up from a book and see him out there on the tier motionless, staring up at Oscar in his bunk reading the Bible. When I was sure that the cold, luminous green eyes had slipped away from the night, I would crack. "Oscar, my man, I like you. Will you take some good advice from a friend? I am telling you, pal, it's driving the dummy off his rocker to see you reading that Bible. Pal, why in the hell don't you stop reading it for your own good?" That square jerk would go on to reading. He hadn't even noticed the dummy's visit. He would say, "I know you're my friend and I appreciate your advice, but I can't take it. Don't worry about me. Jesus will protect me." Mama was writing at least once a week. Every month she visited me. On her last visit, without worrying her too much, I suggested it would be a good idea to put in a long-distance call to the warden once a week just so he would know somebody out there loved me and wanted me to stay healthy. She was looking fine and had saved her money. She had opened the beauty shop. She told me when I came up for parole, she was sure a friend of hers would give me a job. At night, after her visits, I would lie sleepless all night, mentally recapping our sad lives. I could still remember, too, every mole and crease in Henry's face. One night after one of her visits, the radio loudspeaker on the cell house wall blared out, "Springtime in the Rockies." I tried to keep my crying a secret from Oscar, but he heard me. He marked off a chapter in the Bible for me to read, but with the dummy around, I wasn't about to do something stupid like that. The dummy put one over on Jesus and busted Oscar. We had almost finished mopping the flag when the cell house runner brought me 2 wieners from the kitchen. A pal had sent them. I gave Oscar one. He stuck it inside his shirt. I stood my mop against the wall and ducked into an empty cell and wolfed mine down. We have finished mopping and we're at the supply closet putting our mops and buckets away. Oscar was nibbling slowly on his wiener like he was safe and sound at the Last Supper. I saw the giant shadow glue itself against the wall next to the closer door. I looked through the trap door in the corner of my eye. The universe reeled. It was the dummy. He saw the piece of wiener in Oscar's hand. The dummy's green eyes were oscillating. That deadly cane razored through the air and cut a slice of hair and bloody flesh from the side of Oscar's head. The scarlet glob was hanging by a slimy thread of flesh, dangling like an awful earring near the tip of his earlobe. Oscar's eyes walled towards the back of his head as he moaned and slipped to the flag. From the gray, whitish core of the wound, spouts of blood pulsed out. The dummy just stood there, looking down at the carnage. His green eyes were twinkling in excitement. I had seen him every day for 8 months. I had never seen him smile. He was smiling now like he was watching 2 cute kittens frolicking. I stooped to help Oscar. I felt feathery puffs of air against my cheek. The cane was screaming. The dummy was furiously waggling it beside my head. It was screaming, "Get out!" I lay in my cell wondering if the dummy had second thoughts and would try for 2. I heard the voices of the hospital orderlies on the flag taking Oscar away. I remembered the murderous force of the blow the dummy had struck. I remember that pleased look on his face. I knew from Con Grapevine that he was from Alabama. I knew now it hadn't been Oscar's Bible that had put the dummy's balls in the fire. The dummy knew about that crippled Irish girl. Oscar went from the hospital into the hole for 15 days. The charges: possession of contraband food and physical aggression against an officer. I was there, and the only aggression on Oscar's behalf was the natural resistance of his flesh and bone to that steel cane. The parole board met in the joint every month to consider applications. Every con, when he had served to within several months of his minimum, started dreaming of the street and that upcoming parole consideration. Oscar was in the hole, and I missed his company. He was a square, but a nice one, with lots of wry wit. Several cons slightly older than I came in on transfer from the big joint. They claimed to be Mac men. In bad weather, when there was no yard recreation, I would join them at a table on the flag. I didn't talk much. I usually listened. I was fascinated by the yarns they spun about their pimping ability. They had a lot of bullshit, and I was stealing as much as I could from them to use when I got out. I would go back to my cell, excited. I would pretend I had a whore before me. I would stand there in the cell and pimp up a storm. I didn't know that the crap I was rehearsing wouldn't get a quarter in the street. Oscar came out of the hole and was put into an isolation cell on the top tier of the cell house. I didn't see him come in, so I wasn't prepared when I got a chance to go up there. When I got to the cell with his number in the slot, a skinny joker was peeing in his bucket with his back to me. He was in a laughing fit. I checked the number in the slot again. It was Oscar's number, all right. I pulled the key to the supply closet across the bars of the cell door. The skeleton jumped and spun around facing me. His eyes were wild and vacant. It was Oscar. Only that livid bald scar on the side of his head made me sure. He didn't seem to remember me, so I said, "How are you, pal?" I knew they couldn't stop a stepper. He just stood there, his dingus flopping from his open fly. I said, "Jack, you're going to give your bright future the flu if you don't get it out of the draft." He ignored my words, and then, from the very bottom of his throat, I could hear a kind of eerie high-pitched humming or keening, like maybe the mating call of a werewolf. I was beginning to worry about him. I was standing there trying to figure something to say to get through to him. He hadn't been out of the hole for more than 2 hours. Maybe some loose circuit would jar him back to contact. I knew he had been destroyed when he gave me a sly look and went to the back of his cell. He picked up his bucket and thrust his hand into it. He brought out a fist full of crap. He scraped the crap from his right palm into the rigid upturned left palm. Using his left palm as a kind of a palette, he dipped into the crap with his right index finger and started to finger paint on the cell wall. I just stood there in shock. Finally, he stopped, snapped to attention, saluted me, and stuck his chest out proudly, and pointed a crappy finger at his art on the wall. There was an idiot's look of triumph on his face, like he had finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I gave up on him. I went downstairs and told the cell house crew. The next day, they shipped Oscar to the funny farm, where perhaps he is today, 30 years later. My time went fast after the 8th month. I had gone before the parole board and I was waiting for my pink slip. A white one meant denial and a new date for consideration. I saw the mail clerk when he shoved it through the bars of my cell. I leapt up and grabbed the small brown envelope. My hands shook so badly, it took seconds to rip it open. It was pink! I banged my fists against the steel wall of my cell. I was so happy I couldn't feel pain. They dressed me out in a cheap Glen plaid suit. I would have been thrilled to have left that den of pressure in tar and feathers. On the way out, I had to face the bull. When I walked into his office, he said, "Well, Snowball, you must have had your rabbit's foot. So long. See you in a couple of weeks." I wasn't out yet, so I gave him the same uncle smile going out that I gave him coming in. When I walked out of the joint, the fresh air was like a blast of oxygen. It made me woozy. I turned and looked back at the joint. The dummy was standing at the chapel window staring at me, but for once, that steel cane wasn't talking to me. We have reached the ending of this portion of the miniseries on Ralph Reads. I would like, or rather love, to thank you, queens and kings, fellow royalty, for stopping by. You may connect with me via Facebook. Send a friend request to Ralph Anthony Garcia on Twitter and Instagram at RGMC2407. Send an email to rgmc2407@gmail.com, where, if you would like to leave a donation, please use the Zelle app or PayPal.me/RGMC2407 or Cash App. My cash tag is RGMC2407. You may also connect with me on my other channel, RGMC, Ralph Garcia, Master of Ceremonies, and right here on TURN, the United Ronin Networks. We are Ronin. Fellow royalty, pick up a good book, read a good story, and set your good self free. I appreciate you, and I love you like cooked food. I will see you folks for the continuation of this Iceberg Slim miniseries on Ralph Reads. Alright then.